Hi, GVF. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad you're here. And let's just call a spade, that this pandemic has completely thrown our lives off course. And this quarantine, social distancing, lockdown life is economically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually unsustainable. But yet, we're stuck. It just feels like life is indefinitely on hold. But thankfully, we are not entirely without a guide. There is an entire book written in the Hebrew Scriptures for times just like this. Times when life does seem that it's going to be this way forever. Times when life does go off course. Times when we are stuck and wondering if life will ever go back to the way it was. In Hebrew, this is called In the Wilderness, but you and I know it in English as the Book of Numbers. And this week is going to be an introduction to this place that the Bible calls the wilderness. And the thesis is that God purposely leads his people into the wilderness, a place that you and I cannot survive on our own. And he does this in order to teach us to live by grace alone. You and I are more ready than ever to listen to this message. I just want to encourage you now to take a breath and take a moment. Ask God to show you those places in you that are raw and hurting and just need his word to wash over today. And when you're ready, press play and listen to the message.
I had plans. I had plans to do a big Easter outreach. After Easter, I had planned out this sermon series. It was going to be scandalous. I was going to preach through the Song of Solomon. I had plans to go down to San Antonio. Someone had invited me to speak at a men's conference. I was going to speak at the men's conference, eat some really good Tex-Mex. I even had plans to go to the Rocky Mountains this summer. I was going to go stay with these monks high up in the Rocky Mountains and go on a guided spiritual retreat. Jenny and I had plans. We were going to send the kids off to camp for 2 weeks, and we were going to get a real kid-free vacation. I had plans. But instead, I'm sitting at home waiting out this pandemic. Instead, I am here in an empty room talking to a camera. Instead, the only thing I have to look forward to are Zoom calls and another walk in our neighborhood. So I had plans, but all that's been put on hold. So I don't know how you feel about this pandemic. Maybe it's like the best thing that's ever happened to you. Maybe it's the worst, or maybe like me, it's the best and the worst at the same time. But wherever you're at, like on that emotion wheel, I know that all of us are in this place together that we've never been before. Like we're not where we were, but we're not yet where we're going to be. We're not who we were, but we're not yet who we will be. Like we don't quite know where this is going to work out. We're in this in-between phase. Life as we know it is just on hold. So maybe you don't quite feel the way I do, and maybe your life is rolling along nicely. I'm so happy for you. But even if you've somehow dodged this whole thing called Zoom fatigue and the low hum of anxiety that this pandemic has caused for most of us, the fact of the matter is that this experience is for most of us a time where we're just stuck. We're in limbo. We're not here or there. A time where there's nothing we can do to overcome where we're at. Nothing we can do to solve for this problem. Nothing we can do. We're at this place where we're out of control. Life is just on pause. And this, even if this isn't your pandemic experience, I'm sure this is your experience at some point, because this is just a human experience. For some, it comes specifically with this pandemic, but for others, it comes through a phone call. I'm sorry, it's cancer. Or we think your father had a stroke, you need to come home. Or I'm sorry, your position is no longer necessary. For some of us, it comes with a conversation. Your mother and I are getting divorced, or I don't know. One of those surprising things that you're not ready for. For some of us, it comes from like that slow burn of life, like work just gets worse and worse and worse, or your teenage son or daughter just feels more and more and more distant from you and from the Lord. whatever it is for you, all of us come to these places where your plans, your life as you know it, no longer exists. You're not where you were, but you know you're not yet where you should be. You're not who you were, but you're not yet who you will be. Your life is on hold. You're stuck in this place that's uncomfortable, unsustainable, unlivable. And yet in this place, if you listen, if you have the clarity, the ability to hear, you will hear God whisper, your plans might be ruined, but mine aren't. Your life might feel like it's off course, but you're right where you need to be. And this isn't just me speaking. This isn't just my idea. This isn't my speculation. This is the story of salvation. This is how God works again and again and again in the Scriptures. In fact, there's an entire book of the Bible devoted to this topic. There's an entire book of the Bible that speaks into those times when life goes off course, when things feel unsustainable, stuck, when you feel indefinitely on hold. And we know it as the book of Numbers. If you've ever read the book of Numbers, you know why it's called Numbers, because like the first 10 chapters are full of numbers. Like it reads like an ancient Near Eastern census report or something. It's not so exciting. But there's more to the book than Numbers. Do you know what it's called in Hebrew? In Hebrew, the title of the book is not Numbers, it is In the Wilderness. And that's what it's about. It's about this wilderness experience. Literally, it's the historic account of how God leads his people for 40 years of wandering in the Sinai wilderness, this area between Egypt and the promised land of Israel. It's the story of the in-between time. On the one hand, God had already saved his people, already brought them out of Egypt, already saved them out of slavery from this king named Pharaoh. He had already called them his children, set them free, but they were not yet where they were called to be. They were not yet in the promised land. They were not yet living that reality. They're stuck in between for 40 years of just this in-between, unsustainable life in the wilderness. And if you spend any time with this story, you're going to find that it's a lot more than just a historic narrative. In fact, as you dig into it, you find that it's a story of an inner journey, a story of a spiritual journey. And let me just be clear, it's not just their story, it's our story. And it's a story that I would like to suggest that we need to hear right now that might have something to say into our experience in these pandemic days. So over the next few weeks, we are going to dust off this old book called Numbers. And we're going to be in Numbers chapter 11 through 20. It goes on from there, but that's where we're going to focus. And I'm guessing, could be wrong, but I'm guessing it's been a while since you've last brushed up on the book of Numbers. So I thought an introduction was in order. So today, I want to give you kind of like, if you're on Google, I want to give you like the satellite view of the wilderness experience in the Bible. To be more precise, I want to give you some sense of how God works in this place where life is unsustainable, this place of dryness, this place of desperation, of need, this place where you feel like your life is indefinitely on hold. In this place where God whispers, your plans might be ruined, but my plans aren't. So early on in our relationship, Jenny and I learned that the secret to relational contentment in our marriage had a lot to do with claritative communication and specifically communicating our expectations to one another. So, for example, I would ask Jenny, hey, do you want to grab some dinner out tonight? And I'm thinking food. We go out and eat food. And along the way, I run into someone from church, and I find out that, hey, they're free tonight. And so I invite them along. I think this will be great. We'll have a ministry conversation over dinner. But what I later find out, what I did not realize, is that Jenny, the whole time, when she heard me ask, hey, do you want to go out to eat for dinner tonight, she wasn't thinking food. She was thinking like white tablecloths and like a man playing violin. And so I'm utterly confused when she's frustrated with the fact that I've just turned it into a ministry dinner. And all of this comes down. We found out that we can solve all of this if we would just be clear about expectations. Not saying that's ever actually happened to us, just for example, like something that could happen. So, through trial and error, we've learned to say it, don't assume it. Say it, don't assume it. We learn to communicate our expectations with great clarity, and life is much, much better now. So that's what I want to do today. I want to say it and not assume it. When you go through these periods where life is on hold, through these wilderness periods, to use the biblical language, when you go through this time where God, you just feel stuck, you feel desperate, you feel like life is unsustainable, there are a whole list of expectations God has for that time, and He's really, really clear about those, but we need to read those, we need to look at those if we want to go through this without great frustration. So specifically, today, I want to communicate 6 things that you and I should expect when God puts our lives on hold, when we find ourselves in what the Bible calls the wilderness. And these may or may not be revelations to you, but if we don't set these expectations up front, we are setting ourselves up for great frustration. So let's get to it. We're going to cover 6 expectations of life in the wilderness, life when life is on hold. And the first one is this: the wilderness is part of God's plan. It may not be part of your plan. It may feel like your life has been knocked off course, but the scriptures are clear. God has you right where He wants you. So in the book of Exodus, when God shows up, saves His people out of slavery in Egypt, all they know is that, hey, we're supposed to go on a 3-day journey into the wilderness and worship God at Mount Sinai. That's all they know. And then when you read the early stories, it's like, okay, this isn't what we were expecting, but this is so great. Like, we're no longer slaves. We no longer have someone cracking the whip and forcing us into this hard labor all the time. We're no longer living in the old way of life in this frenzied pace. So the first thing they do when they get out into the wilderness is throw a party. But then as you read on, the days turn to weeks, turn to months, and this newness starts to wear off. They start doing the same thing day after day after day, and it starts to wear on them, and they start to yearn for their old way of life. They forget how crushing it was. They forget how misshaping it was to live in Egypt. And in the wilderness, there's nothing to distract them, nothing to busy themselves with, nothing to numb the pain. So when we pick up the story in Numbers chapter 1, we read this, Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt." So did you catch that? So when we come to the book of Numbers, they've been in the wilderness. Their life has been on hold for over a year. Over a year. Like, we've been in this pandemic thing like, 9-10 weeks, and I'm over it. I can't imagine a year. Now here, after over a year into this, the question starts coming up again and again and again. Numbers 14, Numbers 20, Numbers 21, Numbers 32. In all of those chapters, the same question arises. The question that they can't seem to wrap their minds around, and it's this: why? Why are we here? And the answer, again and again and again, is an answer that they don't seem to like, and it's an answer that we might not like, but it's really straightforward. Why are we here? Because God brought us here. We're where God wants us to be. Like, we might feel lost. We might feel like our lives have veered off course, but God has us where He wants us. This wasn't accidental or incidental. God brought us here on purpose because this is the way to the promised land. This is the way to becoming who God has called us to be. It's not around the wilderness, but it's through the wilderness. So point number 1, the wilderness is part of God's plan, which brings us then to the next point. Point number 2, the wilderness is a place of transformation. The wilderness is a place of transformation. God not only uses the wilderness to change where you are, He uses it to change who you are. So the Israelites had been in Egypt for 400 years. So for generations, all they ever knew was Egypt, Egyptian culture, Egyptian food, Egyptian life. For generations, they've been formed by hatred, oppression, racism. For generations, they've been shaped by fear and half-truths in this godless culture. So when God sets these people free and declares them, you are free, you're no longer slaves, you are my children, you are sons and daughters of the Most High. It's true. It's true. God said it. They're free. No longer do they have someone whipping their back and forcing them into labor. No longer do they have oppression and fear that they have to live under. But they don't yet think like free people. It's true. They are children, sons and daughters of God. They are loved, valued, precious to God, but they do not yet think, act, and feel like a people who are sons and daughters of the Most High. And if there's one thing that you should know about God here, it's that He's never content with merely external changes. Like He's not fine with a marriage that looks great on the outside but has no real connection on the inside. He's not great. He's not okay with people who follow rules but have no love. He's not okay with people prettying up and pretending like things are good when their world's coming apart on the inside. God is not satisfied until our hearts are changed, until we've been transformed from the inside out. So what's God do? He takes this people, they're already set free, they're already sons and daughters of God, but they're not yet living it. Or not yet experiencing it. So God leads His people into the wilderness. He's already taken them out of Egypt, but He's not yet taken Egypt out of them. You get it? So the wilderness becomes this place of transformation for them. Whether you lean into God or walk away from God during that time, it's going to change you. And like the Israelites of old, there is no going back to Egypt. There's no chance to be what you were. That door is closed. The only way forward is through it. So God not only uses the wilderness to change where they're at, but who they are. So the next 4 points that we're going to look at, those are points 1 and 2, that the wilderness is God did this. He brought you into the wilderness. It's part of God's plan for your life. And 2, the wilderness is a place of transformation. The next 4 points are really just sub-points of number 1 and 2, describing how God uses the wilderness to transform us from the inside out. But each plays such a pronounced role and has such flavor to it that I wanted to at least mention it here. So number 3 is this: the wilderness is unsustainable on purpose. That God uses our needs to teach us what life is really about. Now, I won't belabor this because this point is probably so obvious, but life in the Sinai wilderness is completely unsustainable. I mean, you could go all Bear Grylls on this thing and probably survive for a couple weeks, but nobody's like building their house, setting up house in the middle of the Sinai wilderness because it's uninhabitable, it's unlivable, it's not made for that. And according to Deuteronomy chapter 8, that's exactly why God brought them there. God brought them there because it was a place where they could not meet their own needs. It was a place where it was impossible to take care of themselves. And God brought them there to that place of desperation, to that place of need, to teach them, according to Deuteronomy chapter 8, that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. To teach them that food, a job, a house, your normal freedoms, your group of friends, those things, maybe they can keep you alive, but they cannot give you the life that you've been created to live. So number 3, the wilderness is unsustainable on purpose. When we get our reserves depleted, when things start drying up, when we're unable to meet our own needs, it starts to feel unbearable. And God wants to use that to draw us to Himself. And that brings us to point number 4. And it's this: the wilderness is where our lives begin to unravel. God allows our lives to unravel so that he can recreate us. So about a year ago, I read a book called The Critical Journey. It's by authors Hegberg and Gulich, if you want to look it up. And they helpfully describe like these 6 stages of the life of faith. The first few stages are pretty obvious if you've lived them before. The first one's just kind of like this awakening, like you come to meet God, to know God, and you're like, wow, he's someone I can know personally. And then you learn about God. So you come to know him personally, and then you grow in knowledge about him. And then the third stage that they talk about is this time where you begin to serve God. They call it the productive life. And these are people who do, serve. But it tends to be a life with a lot of action and not that much of understanding or self-awareness. It tends to be that life that puts doing above being. If you continue down this road long enough, most people, not everyone, but most people will eventually face something, usually a crisis of faith or a crisis of life, that will force them to ask the question, why am I doing all this? What am I doing? Is it really making a difference? Is this really what God asks of me? They're no longer so sure of what they believe or what they should do. And if you press into this crisis, if you step into this, they say that this is the time. Hegberg and Gulich say you'll run into this thing that they call the wall. The wall is the place, according to them, where our will comes face to face with God's will. The wall is where our lives unravel. We come to the end of ourselves. It's the end of our control, the end of what we can understand. It's when life and faith, as we've always known it, as we've held to it, no longer makes sense. Like it has to become something new because it no longer makes sense. This is what the scriptures call being in the wilderness. The very structure of the book of Numbers tells this story. So in the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers, it might read like a bunch of boring, but it's these lists and laws of this is how things are to be structured, and this is how many people are in this group, and this and this and this. It's a picture of order. It's a picture of the way things are supposed to be. It's when life makes sense. Everything fits in its box, and everyone colors within the lines. But then you get to Numbers chapter 11, through 25, and all of this begins to completely unravel. They hit the wall, to use the language of Hegberg and Gulich. The Israelites, they try to cling to their own way of life. They try to make sense of it in the categories that they know. They try to figure out life, try to control it, try to white-knuckle it. They try to put God in the box that they think he should be in. But all of this, it doesn't work. It no longer exists. That's a reality of the past. It no longer works when you're in the wilderness. And with that, the wheels just start coming off. And in the end, we find that the only way for God to move this people forward, to make this people, into his children, God says this entire generation must die off. And the next generation must grow up and become who they're called to be. And then in Numbers chapter 26 through 36, order begins to return. We're back to lists and laws and structures that begin to reshape, remake, recreate these people into a new people, the people that God called them to be. So Hegberg and Gulich, they describe it this way. They say, when you hit the wall, the only way forward is to die, by which they mean to die to self. You, as you've always thought of yourself, as you've always constructed yourself, as you've always found meaning in life, can no longer exist. You're not who you were, and you can no longer be who you were. You have to become someone new if you're going to keep moving forward. You have to let go of who you are. You have to let go of control. You have to let go of your plans, of the ways you've always formed your value and meaning. That the only way through the wall is to die to self. That on the other side of the wall, your old life is over. The old you is gone. God has to rebuild you and put you back together and give you a new identity. Now, I don't know if this speaks to you the way it speaks to me. Maybe you've never hit the wall. Maybe you've never been through a wilderness time. But you will. let me just say that nothing can quite prepare you for it. But maybe whether you're in that now or you're going to hit that someday, maybe knowing that God's people have been hitting this wall, have been going through this process for 3,500 years, maybe knowing that this isn't outside of the plan of God, maybe that'll be of help. But before I give you too much good news or hope, let me be candid. The truth is that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And that's point number 5. The wilderness is a place where your failures will be revealed. That God leads us into the wilderness to test our hearts, to show us who we are, to reveal us. So this is repeated in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. God brings them into the wilderness to test them. Most famously, again, Deuteronomy chapter 8, Moses is preaching to the Israelites just before they go into the promised land. And he says this, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble you and test you in order to know what was in your heart." So in the coming weeks, we're going to really dive into this and unpack this, because this is the heart of the wilderness experience in the book of Numbers. We're going to be looking at temptations in the wilderness, the temptation to become critical, the temptation to put your feelings over God's word, the temptation to only trust God when you feel in control. Anyone? The temptation to misdirect your pain and anger at God, etc., etc. But here's the thing. The book of Numbers, this talk, these are not motivational passages. This is not, try harder, you can do it, this is coming, but you got this. That's not what this message is. Every time God tests his people, they fail. Every time. And I'm not talking like, they're just a little off here. I'm talking like great blasphemous failures. They fail heroically. Like they push everything too far. They go Chernobyl here. Like there's fallout for years. That when God leads them into the wilderness, it shows what they really believe and who they really are. And the wilderness reveals that at their core, at their heart, they are a selfish and unbelieving people. The wilderness doesn't make them selfish and unbelieving. It reveals that they are selfish and unbelieving. It reveals that they prefer slavery over sonship. It reveals that they don't pass the test. They don't deserve to be children of God. They don't deserve the promised land, which begs the question, when you go through the wilderness, when I go through the wilderness, what will it reveal about us? So they went years without any normal comforts. How would you do with that? How are you doing with that? I mean, personally, like if I go a morning without my morning coffee, I'm like questioning the goodness of God. Like, dear God, kill me. I'm joking, but kinda. I'm like, seriously, I'm so used to my comforts, to my way of life, to having control, to having my say, that I would hate to see what the wilderness would truly reveal about my heart. But that's not how the story ends. Thankfully, we're only at point 5. There is one more point, and the last point does point us to some good news. Although it's not necessarily a motivational piece, there is hope in it, and it's this. The wilderness is where we learn, number 6, the wilderness is where we learn to live by faith alone. So Matthew, the tax collector turned follower of Jesus, tells a story about a time before Jesus started his public ministry where he was baptized. He passed through the waters, and then he was led by God, by the Spirit of God, to go out into the wilderness to be tested, to be tempted. And just like the Israelites of old, he's taken by God into the wilderness. His life is thrown off course. His life is put on hold. His ministry is put on hold. Everything stops, and he's taken to this place of desperation and need. And then the text says in Matthew chapter 4 that after 40 days in the wilderness, he was hungry, which might seem obvious. He hadn't had anything to eat for 40 days. But the point being this, God had brought him to a complete and utter desperation, a place where he could not meet his own needs, a place where he was completely gripped by hunger. And at that time, at that moment, Satan came to him to tempt him. Just like the Israelites of old, the wilderness would reveal what he truly believed, who he truly was. And at this point, if you're following along, you're like, Matt, here, we've heard this story before. We know what happens when God's people go into the wilderness and they come to a place of desperation where their life is thrown off course and on hold, and they're tested. They fail. Why are you telling us this story again? But that's not Matthew's story. Jesus faces the exact same temptations that the Israelites faced in the wilderness. The exact same temptations that you and I face in the wilderness. But where we failed, he succeeded. He does what we can't do. He wins the battles we lose. He overcomes the temptations we cannot overcome. And this is the good news. This is the gospel. The bad news is that you will never, ever, ever be able to save yourself. You will never, ever, ever qualify to be a son of God. You will never, ever, ever be good enough to make it on your own, strong enough, smart enough. You'll never be that to make it into the promised land. But the good news is you don't have to. The good news is that where we failed, he succeeded on our behalf. That's the good news. That's what we mean when we talk about giving your life up to Jesus. It's giving up trying to be good enough, giving up trying to be smart enough or strong enough or trying to figure it out on your own and trusting him with that. It's believing that his success is enough, that his love and his victory is enough for you. It's believing that he alone can make you a son or daughter of God. It's believing that he alone can carry you into the promised land. And it's trusting him when you know you can't make it on your own. When you know that you're not good enough, or strong enough, or smart enough, when you know you can't provide for yourself, it's learning to live by faith alone. That you are loved by God, you're a child of God, you're free because of what Jesus did, not because of what you did. And that's where we're headed for the next 5-6 weeks. And that's my prayer for you in this pandemic time. That's my prayer for us. That when life is on hold, we'll learn to trust God that he has us exactly where he wants us. And we'll learn to walk by faith, not by sight. I love you, and I'm praying for you. See you next week.
Thanks again for joining us here on this platform. And let me just leave us with this benediction. It's in Psalm 23, 1-3. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. GVF, hope you have a good week. Stay sane, keep well, and go in peace.